Hey everybody, and welcome to the first stream on my channel. Today I'm here to kind of talk because I want to kick things off about something that every full stack developer that specifically using Next.js will want to know about and understand, and that is server actions. Now, if you're brand new or don't necessarily understand, that's okay. In this stream, I'm going to kind of talk through from a beginner's perspective and how to understand it, going over the documentation, how to implement it, and using a really good article from a developer's website that you would want to have in your arsenal to kind of look things up and just spend some time to review articles and understand articles so you can continue your growth journey. So if this is something that you may be interested in, or if you're just getting started in your journey with web development, I would strongly suggest sticking around because you may find some value in this video. So, if you do have the opportunity to listen in, thank you so much. And if you don't mind, just kind of share where you are listening in from. So, to get started, what I want to do is take a look at the documentation and kind of define what are server actions. And then we will look at we'll look at some examples and kind of build out some server actions on our own. So, with that said, we'll head over to the documentation for Next.js. And if we scroll down, we see server and client components. And what we have or what we see is how to use a server and client component. By default, layouts and pages are server components, which lets you fetch data and render parts of the UI on the server and optionally cache the results and stream it in the client. And we'll kind of discuss that later on as well. When you need the interactive or browser APIs, you can use client components to layer in functionality. So in this article or in this section, it's going to kind of talk about what are server and client components. But before we jump into this, or rather than jumping into this, I would rather just kind of look at server actions in general. Okay, so here it's defined in the Next.js documentation that server actions are asynchronous functions that are executed on the server. They can be called in a server or client component to handle form submissions and data mutations. And there's a video that it links out to. Let's see.
Let's take a look at how you can create forms and handle data mutations with the Next.js app
Okay.
router and
Links out
server
to
actions.
Lee
Before
Robb,
we get
one of
started, let's see
the
what we'll build.
contributors to Next.js. Very cool YouTube channel. I would suggest checking it out. So a server action can be defined with the React use server directive. You can place it at you can place the directive at the top of an asynchronous function to mark the function as a server action, or at the top of a separate file to mark all exports of that file as a server action. So based on this, it appears that you can use it at the top of a file, or you can use it within a asynchronous function. You know, asynchronous requests are server requests, and if you have it or if you mark it as a client component, you can't use that function as asynchronous. So it sounds like you can either mark the entire file as use server using the use server directive, or you can specifically use the use server directive within a asynchronous function if you don't want to mark the entire file as use server. So it's pretty interesting to understand or to know. The server components can use the inline function level or module level use server directive to inline a server action, add use server at the top of the function body. Okay, so here's just what it kind of looks like in code. So I guess if you wanted to make this a client side page, you can mark it as use client, not have an asynchronous function, but still use a server action. Notice that the function itself is asynchronous, and within it, it is marked as use server. So a server function and a client component can create a new file, add the use server directive at the top. All exported functions within the file will be marked as server functions that can be reused in both client and server components. So this appears, if you want to separate out the server actions, You don't have to necessarily have it within a client component. If you want to just have an entire file marked as a server file, you'll use a separate file named Actions or whatever you would like, and mark that file as use server at the top, and then have your asynchronous functions within this page, with the understanding that everything that you export will be ran on the server and under the use server directive. And it looks like it's showing a button, and this button is client side with use client, and you're importing the action inside of the button. Okay, so it looks like you're using the on click handler to call the create function that you created within the app slash actions.ts file. And you could pass the action as a prop. You can also pass a server action to a client component as a prop, and that's what's being done here. And here's just kind of what the code looks like broken out. Okay, so sorry about that. Usually the Next.js TypeScript plugin would flag update item action in the use client component, and well, excuse me, in client component.tsx, since it is a function which generally can't be serialized across the client server boundaries or the props. Okay, so that's just basically just kind of defining out how it has to be passed in and some of its limitations, and what it will perform like when you're running it on the actual application itself. So that's okay. And here's the behavior. Server actions can be invoked using the action attribute in a form element. And that's the approach that we'll probably end up using, or that I typically use when I use Next.js and server actions. Server components support progressive enhancement by default, meaning the form will be submitted even if JavaScript hasn't loaded yet or is disabled. So that's a good thing because not all browsers use JavaScript. Some browsers, depending upon the computer and what the user may have, they may not have JavaScript or may not be able to run it. So this doesn't allow you to use JavaScript, and it'll make sure that's going to enhance or make sure that it is compatible with those that actually have access or use JavaScript or don't. In client components, forms invoking server actions will queue submissions if JavaScript isn't loaded yet, prioritizing client hydration. After hydration, the browser does not refresh does not refresh on form submission. Server actions are limited to the form tag, and can be invoked form handlers using the use effect third-party libraries and other form elements like button. So it's just saying that you can use either the form or button or the use effect in order to call or utilize the server action. It integrates with Next.js caching and revalidation architect When an action is invoked, Next.js can return both the updated UI and new data in a single server round trip. Behind the scenes, actions use the post method and only use HTTP method can invoke them. Comments can invoke the value of server actions. Okay. And server actions inherit the runtime from the page or layout that are used on the server, and inherit route segment config. All right. Example. So here's what it looks like with an example. React extends the HTML form element to allow server actions to be invoked with the action prop. And that is what we see here. When invoked a form, the action automatically receives the form data object. You don't need to use React use state to manage the fields. Instead, you can extract the data using the native form data methods. And if you aren't familiar with those, the form data methods are append, which appends a new value on an existing key inside a form data object or adds the key if it does not exist already. So this is just the same thing that you would see inside of a JavaScript method. This allows you to add a value if it doesn't already exist. Form data.get deletes a key value pair from the form data object. .entries returns an iterator that iterates through all key value pairs contained in the form data. This is just, form data.entries. That's what it does. Basically just loops through or reviews and returns each key value pair. Form data.get returns the value associated with a given key form within a form data object. That's just going to allow us to get the data from the form data or get the items or the name and ID data from the form data that we're getting from the front end. And that's what we're going to be using throughout the project. Form data.getAll returns an array of the values associated with a given key form within a form data. Returns an array of the values associated with a given key from within a form data, and form data.get returns the value associated with the given key from within a form data object. You have .has, which returns whether a form data object contains a certain key. So if you were just wanting to iterate and see if it had a certain key, you would use .has. .keys returns a iterator iterates through all keys of the key value pairs contains in the form data. So that's just going to return the iterator itself. .set, .value. So there are several of them. And here's how it works with each browser. So you see, for the most part, compatibility is good except in certain browsers. So that's going to be a good thing. Sorry to bore you with reading through all of those, but I just want to take a second to take a look at it. And here's what a form action will look like. You pass in, or you use the action element, pass in the asynchronous function. Here it is written within the actual page itself, and it has the use server directive. So this could be a client side page, not 100% sure, but here's just what a asynchronous request with use server directive written inside of it will look like. So good to know. Form with loading and error states, which we can certainly explore adding that at a later time. When working with forms that have many fields, you may want to consider using the entries method with JavaScript's object. For example, const raw form data is equal to object.form entries, passing in the form data. One thing to note is that the form data will include additional action properties. So that just basically saying that if we use the entries method, form entries, we can pass in the actual form, and that will allow us to get error and loading states, so that if there's an error being returned from the server, we can pass that back to the user so they can make the correction. Or if the form is being submitted, we can show a loading state back to the user so that they can know that the form is being submitted, and just bear with us or bear with the process, and we'll let you know once the loading state is complete and you can now view the data. So passing additional arguments, you can pass additional arguments to a server action using JavaScript bind method. So this is good if you want to use a user profile. You could pass in the user ID, and you can use update user.bind to pass in if it is null. Well, by default it is null, but we should be receiving the user ID. And then once we capture that user or perform some form of validation inside of the form action, we can use this function and use this to update the user's information. So the server action will receive the user ID argument in addition to the form data. Yep. Good to know. An alternative is to pass arguments as hidden inputs fields inside of the form. Yep, we've done that before. That's just basically passing in that data and hiding it so that it is not visible to the user, but it will be submitted once the form is submitted so that it can be passed into the server function itself. .bind works in both server and client components. It also supports progressive enhancement. Okay, it's good to know. Nested form elements. You can also invoke a server action and elements nested inside of a form, such as a button, input type submit, and input type image. These elements accept the form action prop or event handlers. Okay. It's useful in cases where you want to call multiple server actions within a form. Okay. For example, you can create a specific button, element, or saving a post draft. In addition to publishing it, you have the form documents here. Okay. I'm not going to talk through programmatic form submission right now. Form validations. This is suggesting to use Zod, which is something that I've used in previous videos, so I'm pretty comfortable with that. Utilizing the object with and passing in the actual value, which is a email, and then using the dot string method and identifying the error. Okay. Once the fields have been validated on the server, you can return a serialized object in your action and use the React use action state hook to show a message to the user. By passing the action to the use action state, the actions function signature changes to receive a new previous state or initial state parameter as its first argument. Use action state as a React hook and therefore must be used in a client component. Yep. So you will probably separate that out, which is what it's going to suggest to you. So this is the actual action that's going to run on the server to perform the update based on the data that is being submitted in the form. And remember, you are destructuring it. Then you can pass in your action to the use action state hook and use the return state to display the error message. So in the client side component, app folder, UI folder, signup.tsx. You mark it as a client side file and you're passing you'll import the use action state from React and you'll also bring in the action create user from the actions.ts file. You're defining your initial state and inside of the sign up function, you're passing in the use action state, declaring the state there, and also passing in two parameters, create user and initial state, which is what the two parameters that correspond with the two parameters that we're passing in the form action. And then in the return statement, you have the action itself, which is the form action. But the key here is you're using this syntax in order to define the error. So if there's a state message, you want to use state with a question mark dot message. It also gives us access to the use state hook. Well, excuse me, it also gives access to pending states, which is pretty cool. We also get access to pending states. The use action state hook exposes a pending Boolean that can be used to show a loading indicator when the action is being executed. So if we click submit while that is being processed, we'll see a loading indicator. Alternatively, you can use the use form status hook to show a loading indicator while the action is being executed. When using the hook, you'll need to create a separate component to render the loading indicator, for example, to disable the button when the action is pending. So here we have app UI button.tsx. You'll mark that file as use client, import the use form status from React DOM, and inside of the button, you'll want to destructure pending from use form status. And in the return statement, you'll have the button that's disabled, that has a, excuse me, that's being passed in disabled with a pending state and also type of submit. Okay. You can also nest the submit component inside of a form. So that is very convenient. And I think what I'll do when we do create ours, not the initial one, but eventually we'll conditionally render it so that it serves as a create and also update. Good to know in React 19 use for status includes additional keys on the return object like data method and action. If you are not using React 19, only the pending key is available. Okay. So you have to have the latest version of React in order to take advantage of this particular, or excuse me, the object like data, method, and action. Otherwise, you'll only see the pending key. Okay. It also gives the ability to optimistic updates. You can use the React use optimistic hook to optimistically update the UI before server actions finishes executing rather than waiting on a response. So this is pretty cool. So basically what this is saying is that it's going to anticipate what that action will be and go ahead and optimistically update it before it gets a response back from the server. And it appears that this has to be done in a client side page. As we see the use client directive at the top, we're importing use optimistic, and we're also bringing in send from the actions directory that we created. We define our type. We're using that hook. Our form action receives form data. It's grabbing the message, utilizing that hook and passing in the message, and it is awaiting the send of that message. And in the return statement, we're using the optimistic excuse me, we're using the optimistic message that we just created and mapping over it, defining each of them as M and passing in I as the key, and just displaying that message and optimistically updating it every time it is updated. Also get access to event handlers. While it's common to use server actions within the form elements, they can also be invoked within event handlers such as on click, for example, to increment a like. So this is a like button.tsx file marked as use client. We're bringing in a function named increment like from the actions directory and use state from React. In it, we're passing in the initial likes, so whether that is 3 or 4 likes, and it is defined as a number type, which could have been separated out, but it's just being passed into the function here. We're using use state to capture our likes and set the like state. And right here, it looks like we're using a p tag to show the actual number of likes. And this button, as mentioned, is an event handler that is incrementing or utilizing a server action to increment the like. So that's pretty cool. Can also add an event handler to form elements, for example, to save a form field on change. Looks like with this one, we have the ability to edit a post based on the edit post.tsx naming, utilizing the publish post and save draft action inside of a function named edit post, which returns form action of publish posts and gives the user a text area that they can utilize to update or document, and once complete can publish this post. For cases like this where multiple events might be fired in a quick session, we recommend debouncing to prevent unnecessary server action invocations. Debouncing is basically just managing the amount of requests so that you're not making too many requests to the server at once. When you do that, that can overwhelm your server and cause performance issues. So you want to try to manage that. I've talked about that in a previous video, but I can cover it again if need be. Use effect can be, use effect is the use react use effect. Let me re-say that. You can use the react use effect hook to invoke a server action when the component mounts or a dependency changes. This is useful for mutations that depend on a global event or need to be triggered automatically. For example, on key down for app shortcuts, or intersection observer hook for infinite scrolling, or when the component mounts to update a view count. Okay. So here we have the app directory with a file named viewcount.tsx. It is a client-side component, and it looks like we basically are just updating the total amount of views and just utilizing the use state and use effect hook in order to do that in a client-side file. Okay. We also gain access to error handling. When an error is thrown, it could be caught by the nearest error.js or suspense boundary. That's going to be pretty cool to kind of talk about, but good to know. Aside from throwing the error, you can also return an object to be handled by the use action state. And here's just kind of what it looks like. So we could use the use action state to show the pending state of the form, but also show server-side validation, which I could talk about later on. Revalidate data. You can revalidate the Next.js cache inside of the server action. Now, this is something that we'll certainly use and that I really enjoy. So let's just say that you create a new item or update an item. If you use the revalidate path from Next cache, it's going to automatically update that data without needing to refresh the page, which is a much better user experience and something I think that you would certainly enjoy, because it kind of gives a real-time feel, if you will, to the UI. Or invalidated specific data fetching with cache tag using revalidate tag. Okay. Redirecting, if you would like to redirect the user to a different route or completion of a server action, you can use the redirect API. That's pretty straightforward there. Cookies, you can get, set, and delete cookies inside of a server action using the cookies API. Here's just what that looks like. I may make a video on cookies. That would be a pretty interesting topic to kind of talk about. Okay. Security by default. Okay. I won't dive into much of that. Authentication, grabbing the user off if there's no user that's being destructured from the off. Throw error, you must be signed in. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, so we see what the documentation kind of speaks to as it relates to server actions with Next.js. What I want to do now is take a look at a very good and thoroughly written document about server actions in Next.js that I thought that has a very good explanation and could be something that you would want to implement and utilize in your learning journey. And what I mean by that is you don't want to just watch tutorials or watch videos. You want to actually understand and get used to actually reading, understanding the documents and how to implement it. One piece of it is usually documentations are written very straight to the point with a certain tone that you have a level of understanding of what coding is and what it looks like. So what I want to try to do is kind of bridge that gap to kind of help understand what that looks like or how to interpret the documentation if you're someone that's new and maybe don't have a whole lot of experience with it. But the other thing that you also want to try to do is as you're understanding or reading it, you want to be able to implement it and understand how the terminology and the lingo so that you can apply it to your own project because you're not going to always have a video or tutorial or someone to walk you through it. But so in my own personal journey, if you will, what I like to do is read documentation and implement it in projects and build out things of my own. So one of the documents that I like to read a lot is the web developer document here on screen, and I'll include it in the description below. But basically, this is a article written by Nikita, and I don't want to butcher your name, brother, but he has a mini series of documents that he's written or walkthroughs, if you will, about Next.js server actions, what they are, what is server side rendering, server components, server actions, the app router, and also parallel and intercepting routes. I'm going to talk through these because I thought this was extremely well written and it was certainly worth doing a review on and kind of talking through and reading through it. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and read through this documentation and we will create our own application based on the documents that he's written. And we'll just kind of modify it a little bit so that it's maybe not as detailed with all the styling as his, but certainly the main functionality with server action. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and open up my VS Code so we could do a little bit of coding. And click open folder, and we'll call this server actions